Welcome everyone to the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance, otherwise known as YANA, our monthly webinar. I am Rachel Littman, the Executive Director of YANA, and I'm also Saybrook College, class of 1991. Today, we are lucky to have with us Tim Delaney, Yale College class of 79, and the President and CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits located in Washington, D.C. Tim and his colleagues represent more than 25,000 organizational members across the country, providing advocacy, support, and a wealth of information and resources, much of which can be accessed through their website, councilofnonprofits.org, and I highly recommend you go there. Tim will be speaking today on trends in the nonprofit sector and the roles that nonprofits play in our communities and our lives. And just a note about logistics, this session will be recorded and available for viewers on our YouTube channel within the next few weeks. We will also have some materials to forward to our attendees that Tim has kindly provided. I will be monitoring the chat and the question functions in the Zoom platform, so feel free to ask any questions along the way. If we can unmute people individually at the end for the Q&A session, we will do so. Otherwise, I will monitor the written questions and relay them to Tim either during the presentation or at least at the end, towards the end of the hour for the formal Q&A session. So without further ado, Tim, I'm going to hand the screen over to you. I will put myself on mute, and thank you everyone for participating, and thank you to Tim and your colleagues.
Great, thank you, Rachel, and boodle boodle to everybody. What we're going to be talking about today is nonprofit impact matters. And as Rachel just indicated, our network is the largest network of charitable nonprofits across the country. We have more than 25,000 members, including over 800 foundations from coast to coast and border to border. There's a map of our members. We are organized through our state associations of nonprofits and nonprofit allies in the various states. You'll see some states do not have a logo on them. We affectionately refer to those as our naked states because they don't have coverage by a state association. We have found that if we come in from DC and say, hi, we're smarter than you and we're telling you to set up a new organization, it doesn't go over very well. And so we really wait for organizations to develop it from the grassroots so that it's a natural entity that it's growing. One of the things that we do is reinforce that you are not alone. So for the nonprofit in Missoula or in Mobile, Alabama, or in Miami, or pick another M city, they are not by themselves. They can connect to more than 25,000 other groups across the country to find out what some of the trends, what some of the issues are, how others have solved problems. You'll see at the bottom of the screen there that if you go to our website, councilofnonprofits.org, something will pop up at the bottom of your screen and you can find your state association, how to contact them and engage with people in your own area. Now that you are not alone is not just for us. If you look at YANA's acronyms, you will see it actually spells out you are not alone. And that is one of the powers of joining YANA, is the opportunity to engage with other nonprofit practitioners who are Yale alums so that we can all be learning from each other and supporting each other. One of the great things about this particular network is that it is award-winning. The organization YANA was set up about a decade ago, and they've already swept 7 different consecutive awards from the Yale Alumni Association Board of Governors. One of the reasons that they've done that is because of their strong communications, their 2018 annual report, for example. And then on the right, you'll see the sidebar for the award-winning newsletter. So again, good reason to get involved, to learn from your peers across the country. Now, I'm going to be talking about nonprofit impact matters. This is a special report that we at the National Council of Nonprofits wrote and published late last year. It is a report that has been in our minds for about the decade that I've been here. I'm an attorney by background with a strong policy bent, And when I came here, just a few weeks later, the nation's economy cratered, and our organization pivoted and started getting more engaged with public policy issues. As we've crisscrossed the country over this past decade, we have learned that one of the problems with our sector is we often feel picked upon like no one's paying attention. And so we keep trying to tell people outside the sector, lawmakers, reporters, businesses, whomever, why don't they understand us? And we started thinking, we need to tell the story to our own folks. To our knowledge, no one had ever written a report for nonprofits, by nonprofits. There's been a lot of information out there by academics and scholars, but not much about nonprofits from the vantage point of nonprofits. So we pulled together this report, and there are 4 things that you can get access to. First is the actual national report. You can download it for the price of $0. It's free. We wanted to make sure that this information got spread as broadly as possible. So the national report is there. You will also be able to download an infographic that will have a lot of the information. Also on the interactive website, you will find that not only will you be able to get state-specific data that's not in the actual national report, but you will also be able to go and grab some of the photos that or graphics that are in the report in my PowerPoint that I'm going to be presenting. So if you find that you're going to be presenting information to other organizations or your own boards or whatever, you'll be able to download those for free. So have at it. And as Rachel mentioned, we will have some materials that she'll be sending out afterwards that will provide all these different websites that have been popped up so far. So again, why this report? Well, we started thinking, what if the 12.3 million nonprofit employees and the 64 million nonprofit board members and volunteers and the tens of millions of nonprofit donors across the country started to understand more about what the sector is and could see what we are all about. If we could all be singing from the same song sheet, we could be much more effective as advocates for our organizations. And not just advocates in front of public bodies, but also advocates with your neighbors, advocates with smart people to get involved as employees or as board members or as volunteers. And so there's a lot of different ways that this information can be used if we get it out there and people are using it. The contents of the report itself, and I'm going to be walking through the various components just so that you know what the resources are, is reading the fine print, nonprofit missions matter, nonprofits at a glance, some of the challenges that we face, and what you personally can do to make a difference. In terms of reading the fine print, what we're trying to do is make better informed consumers of nonprofit data. We have been dismayed as we go out and look at various news reports that will say 27% of nonprofits this or 72% of donors that, and it turns out it's from some for-profit entity that's trying to market itself, and it will do a survey of 50 of their clients. Well, that's really not the scientifically valid data, and yet they're marketing it that way. And we've also seen, even in fine publications, data that when you look at the fine print and track down in the footnotes or the endnotes, that it's data from 1987. Well, how relevant is it today? And so we're trying to get people to focus more on the numbers. And another number that we want people to look at is the number of the federal statutes. There are more than 35 different types of nonprofits or federal tax-exempt organizations in the U.S. 501c3s are charitable nonprofits. They are Yale University is a charitable nonprofit. When you make a donation to a charitable nonprofit, you can deduct it. But if you make a donation to a 501c5, which is a labor union, or a C6, a professional association or chamber of commerce, those are not tax deductible as charitable contributions. They may be deductible as a business expense, but not as a charitable nonprofit. The reason that this is important right now in an election year is that you're going to see a lot of stories from reporters saying political nonprofit outspends this political party or that one. Those are not 501c3 charitable nonprofits. Those are C4 organizations that, under the Citizens United case from the Supreme Court, allows a lot of dark money to go behind the scenes. Nobody knows who's making the contributions or how much, and they're swaying things. But when reporters write stories that say nonprofits are giving millions of dollars to political candidates, a lot of individuals say, I didn't give my money for that purpose, and they stop giving their money. And it's because of confusion. So we talk to reporters and try to get them to tell the story about non-charitable nonprofits that are engaging in those types of activities, or dark money organizations as opposed to nonprofits, to alleviate some of the confusion that goes on out there. Nonprofit missions matter. There has been an attempt in probably the last decade and a half, to get nonprofits to start speaking in business terms, and that's coming from those of us who are advocates, who are trying to get legislators to hear us, and they like to translate things into jobs, and it's also coming from philanthropists in technology who are thinking that they can take their wisdom and apply business principles to the work of nonprofits and turn them around. Phil Buchanan with the Center for Effective Philanthropy has written a book and has been great on the speaking circuit to try to educate philanthropists that that's not the way to go, because it's overlooking a lot of the soft elements, the soft benefits of nonprofits, not just the dollars and cents. And some of those include that nonprofits are where Americans come together to solve problems. We're promoters of civic engagement. We're the building blocks of democracy. We're the laboratories of leadership, and we're also economic engines that shouldn't be left out of the equation. So, nonprofits are where Americans come together to solve problems. Democracy in America. Here are my copies from the two political science courses I took back in Yale, where we heard from de Tocqueville that what set America apart from all European nations that he was familiar with was the way that Americans had an instinct, it's in our DNA, to come together at the drop of a hat to try to solve problems. We didn't rely on the monarchy, we didn't rely on the church, we were relying on ourselves to solve the community problems, and that's carried forward into modern day. And part of that is looking at the relative size of nonprofits. 92% of America's nonprofits have an income of less than $1 million. 88% spend less than $500,000. And so when a lot of people are talking about nonprofits, they conjure up in their heads Mother Yale, or they're thinking in terms of the huge hospital or American Red Cross, but they don't really think about those local nonprofits that are meeting local needs. And that's where we need to be trying to help and support those smaller organizations, because that's where people really come together to promote civic engagement, to get people to register to vote, to get involved in the census. And that's part of the work that we do, is reaching into the communities to help get people engaged and involved. We're also the building blocks of democracy by standing up and having a say in our own government and having people step forward together. We're the on-ramp to community engagement. Now, nonprofit lobbying is legal. I don't care what the lawyers or the accountants or the academics, the three A's, the three amigos that keep trying to stifle the voices of charitable nonprofits. It is legal. I'm a lawyer. I can tell you it is absolutely legal. It's in the Constitution. we're in there trying to help people to use their First Amendment rights of freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition their governments. And then Congress has said so in statutes, and the IRS has said so. It is legal. And if you hear a so-called nonprofit attorney or accountant tell you otherwise, they are passing along false lore, and have them contact me, because I'd be more than happy to help them get it straight. And I will confess, I'm doing so in part to address past sins of myself, because when I was a young pup lawyer in a large law firm, I was told, yes, get engaged in the community, but don't allow your nonprofits that you're working with to get close to public policy or lobbying, because they could lose their tax exempt status. And that was the lore, and it continues to get passed down. And we have an obligation to call time out and correct that myth. Nonprofits are also laboratories where people learn about leadership. I don't know how many of you all took courses on leadership at Yale. At least back in the day, they didn't offer them. I had a wonderful course on power, but not on leadership per se. I then went on to the LBJ school and UT Law School, and they didn't teach me those leadership skills in those advanced degrees. I became a partner at a big law firm. Really didn't learn about leadership there either. Where I learned about leadership was getting involved in the community when I was asked to serve on a nonprofit board's committee, and then on the board, and then to chair the committee. And that's where I really learned my leadership skills, is out in the community. And my experience is not abnormal. I see that time and again from other folks. And I think that we need to recognize the power of all these different soft skills, these soft benefits from nonprofits, as real benefits, significant ones, even though they're not directly related to dollars. Now, as I have been crisscrossing the country for the last decade, learning and hearing, I started to translate some nonprofit things into my life, because if you look at various studies, when you ask people to identify nonprofits, they can sometimes pick one or two, like Boy Scouts or American Red Cross, but to ask them to name 3 or 4, they stop, because they really don't think about how nonprofits have impacted their lives. So we put together this sheet, and it's in the Nonprofit Impact Matters report, and just some of the things. I was born in a nonprofit hospital. I remember walking around with March of Dimes cans, collecting dimes to fight polio when I was just a young tyke. I remember going to church very early on. I learned how to swim at Scout Camp. I learned how to strike out gracefully because I had a lot of practice doing it at the Y. And I went to Mother Yale only because of a generous scholarship. And all of these things have impacted my life. And so with that, I encourage you to call time out right now. Please pull out a sheet of paper right in front of you now. Pull out a sheet of paper. Now turn it horizontally and draw a line down the middle. And it doesn't have to be exactly straight. And then put some markings on it as, you know, where were you born? 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years, 40, 50. If you want to go out to 60, 70, 80, I'm glad that you're with us. And then just take a moment and think in terms of how nonprofits have impacted your life. I'm going to give everybody about a minute or so just to reflect and think about how nonprofits have influenced your life.
It's a great exercise. Thank you, Tim.
You bet. And Rachel, I don't know if you can unmute everybody now, or you want to invite people to send in questions.
Sure. People, anyone, if you'd like to share a couple of interesting ones, feel free to put it in the Q&A. You can ask a question or you can put it in the chat bar. Feel free to share. I think you started with some nice ones, Tim, and maybe I'll just add on to get the flowing a little bit. I went to private Quaker schools. They were a mixture of religious and nonprofit. Obviously, YANA is part of my life. All the museums I've gone to, all the zoos, the ballet, the symphony, the parks. Some are government, some are run by private conservancies. All the outdoor space I see. That's just to name a few. Anybody else would like to?
Others, in different parts of the country, libraries are nonprofits. In other parts, they're governmental, and sometimes they're quasi-connected. So there's a variety of different ways that people can connect. And I've done this now in a couple different live audiences, and people seem to really enjoy. I've been surprised at the reactions afterwards where people come up and talk. That they hadn't ever slowed down to think about this. And so I think it's an exercise worthy of people taking into their own nonprofit boards and having people reflect about how your life has benefited from the work of nonprofits. So, but again, so often it all gets back to dollars and cents. And nonprofits are economic engines. We employ 12.3 million people. Our payrolls exceed those of most other U.S. industries. We consume jobs. When, Rachel, you're going to some of those museums or the theaters or the ballet, you might think about getting a cute pair of shoes or going out to dinner beforehand or going out for drinks with friends afterwards. And so you're consuming goods because of the nonprofit. It's creating jobs because of the nonprofit. Nonprofits spend nearly $1 trillion annually. And we attract other employees to communities. I challenge you, go to your local Chamber of Commerce, look at their top 10 reasons that they invite companies to move there. Invariably, there will be at least 2 nonprofits listed on that. It could be a hospital, it could be a museum, it could be a university, but all these driving forces that attract employers. Speaking of employers, nonprofits employ that 12.3 million, that represents more than 10% of the private workforce. Charitable nonprofit sector as a whole is the 3rd largest employer in the country, larger than manufacturing, larger than construction, larger than finance and insurance, and on and on. It's retail and food retail that are number 1 and 2. And so we are a huge sector. We are a huge economic engine that is left out of discussions when policymakers are making decisions. So here's some more information, nonprofits at a glance. I mentioned before our relative size. 97% of nonprofits spend less than $5 million annually. And it's something like 1.9% spend more than 10 million. And so most nonprofits are relatively small. So we're deeply ingrained in local communities. Where does our revenue come from? Almost half of the money comes from private fee-for-services. What's that? How about tuition and room and board at universities? Or when you go into a nonprofit hospital, they don't deliver children or do the heart transplant for free. They charge. Now, a lot of the money comes from insurance companies. Some of the money will come from individuals paying. But again, about half the revenue for the sector as a whole comes from private fees for services. Almost a third comes from government grants and contracts. And not quite 9% is donated from individuals. Foundations is less than 3%. Then corporations less than 1%. So that's the sector as a whole. That's not to say that individual nonprofits should have that as their business model that they should try to match. Every nonprofit is going to have its different business model, but most people, we have found, when you talk to them about where does nonprofit money come from, they think foundations and individual giving, and those are important. Our organization here relies on the grants from large foundations, but we need to recognize where some of this money comes from. Why it matters? I personally, when I was in private practice and then at the Attorney General's office, I heard state legislators say that nonprofits the foundation should be paying for certain programs, and that the state legislature wanted to cut funding for various programs. So we looked a couple of years ago when the White House was proposing cutting $193 billion from SNAP, or food stamps. That wasn't eliminating the entire program, it was just proposing a large cut in those services for food stamps. In order to make up that $193 billion, fortunately it didn't go through, but if it had, to try to make up for that, it would have required taking the 15 largest foundations in the country, Gates and Ford and Lilly and Hewlett and Packard and Kellogg, etc., and not only taking all their gifts for that 1 year, but actually wiping them out entirely, taking all their assets and closing their doors permanently just to fill that one gap in that one program. That's why we need to be lifting our voices as citizens to say, governments at the federal, state, and local levels, you cannot continue to cut spending on these programs, because what you're, in essence, are doing is throwing the weight of all those human needs onto our backs, and we don't have the money to fill the gaps. Now, some of the challenges that we're facing across America is nonprofits are straining to meet the increasing public needs. Policy proposals at all levels of government are threatening us. We have worrisome trends about charitable giving and the continued lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion in this sector as in all others. So in terms of the many strains that we're facing, the human needs were greater in 2017 in 3/4 of the states than they were before the Great Recession began. That there is this illusion that everything is going wonderfully because the stock market has been doing wonderfully. But on Main Street, it's not happening. It's not translating. The human need is great. 40% of Americans are only one missed paycheck away from poverty. 40 million Americans are already living in poverty. There's a lot of pain out there, folks, and it's nonprofits that are trying to meet that need, but we are having increasing challenges raising the money. Total household giving was down again in 2018, and we're expecting the same again in 2019, because that's been a trend for the last 15 years. Now, if you look at the headlines will report, oh, more money given last year than ever given before. Well, that's great when Warren Buffett and the Gateses and Jeff Bezos of Amazon and others are giving their multi-billion-dollar gifts, all of which are important. I don't want to denigrate that in the slightest. The Gates Foundation just gave $100 million yesterday to fight the coronavirus. It's very important what they're doing. But the gifts from these billionaires usually go to create a new school of X at their alma mater. It's going to big international causes. It's going to big things. Remember where nonprofits are? We're community, local based. It's the local community-based nonprofits that are not getting the money that we used to, because the large gifts are going to huge institutions, and there's smaller organizations that are doing the food banks and the homeless shelters and other things are not getting the revenues. And part of that is because of the change in the 2017 Tax Act that got rid of basically doubled the standard deduction, and so there's no longer an incentive for regular people like me to give. It's only the wealthy who have the continued financial incentive to give. Now, people are continuing to give, but we are concerned that last year was the first year that people had completed their own income tax, and many were shocked and said, gee, I didn't get any benefits from making donations. What's that going to do this year? We had an entire century of incentives for people to be giving charitable contributions. That was taken away from regular Americans. And we're trying to get Congress to rectify the damage it's done, but they are saying, gee, we want to wait 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 or 5 years, so that we can get more data on how bad the damage was. And in the meantime, local nonprofits are closing their doors. There's also continued lack of diversity, equity, inclusion in the sector. We can't just say that it's the private sector or government that's lagging. We're lagging too. 72% of charitable nonprofits are led by women, but the female CEOs are paid less than their male counterparts. How can we be doing that, folks? We need to be cleaning up our own act, as we're also calling for others to do better. 80% of respondents in a recent survey said that lack of racial diversity at the top of nonprofits is a big problem. Not a small problem, not an irritant, but it's a big problem. We all have to embrace change and get about it quickly. So what can you do to help? You can protect the public trust. Translated, that means to make sure your own nonprofit is following the laws, is complying with what the expectations are. You can apply the power of nonprofit networks. Get engaged in YANA. Get engaged in your state association of nonprofits. Embrace diversity, equity, inclusion, and advocate for your mission. That's what drives nonprofit impact, is everyday advocacy. Going out and talking to your neighbors about the important work that your nonprofit does, whether you're on the board, you're otherwise a volunteer, or you're a paid employee. We need to be talking to our neighbors. We need to be talking to businesses. We need to be talking to journalists, as well as elected officials, to explain to them the mission that you have and how you're meeting it, and what the human needs are out there. There's this false assumption in America, especially with the decline of our newspapers, as more than 2,000 newspapers across America have closed their doors in the last couple of decades because of the internet and advertising dollars going elsewhere. But there's this presumption then that everything is happening at the federal level because there's not a local newspaper covering it at the local level anymore, or it's a very thin paper without much content. And everyone keeps thinking that all the solutions come from DC and the Capitol, and that's just false. It's not just me saying it's false. Look at the data. How about making some data-driven decisions and recognizing that most of the laws are being enacted at the state level, not in Congress. Yes, what Congress does influences everybody, but if they take away a charitable giving incentive or lessen its impact, that's happening everywhere, but it can actually be even worse at the state legislative level if they take away not only your state charitable giving incentive, but also your tax exemption for property tax. And so we all have to engage on what's going on in our own backyards. And now, all policy work is vertically integrated. It's federal, state, and local. And through the National Council of Nonprofits, we do just that. We get involved at the federal level. Through our state associations, we engage at the state level, and they in turn get involved at the local level. And it's also, horizontally integrated in that we move from the legislative branch to the executive branch to the judicial branch. And again, here at the National Council of Nonprofits, we do all of those. And that's why we have come up with this concept of, call it a tic-tac-toe board or a bingo card. Bingo, nonprofit policy. And the ability to track what's going on at the various levels to see what's happening. It might be that the census, the Department of Commerce at the federal level wanted to insert a very controversial citizenship question in the census questionnaire. Had they been successful, it would have definitely driven millions of people to be undercounted. Now, the politicians are doing it for their re-election purposes, but from the nonprofit vantage point, if an area is undercounted, that means that all those federal dollars will not go into that state and into that locality, meaning that you at the nonprofit level will have to be bearing the burden because people were not counted in your local jurisdiction or in your state, and therefore you will suffer, even though the politicians may see a partisan advantage. That's why we got involved and filed an amicus brief in the U.S. Supreme Court. That's why we play in the executive branches and in the legislative branches at all levels. And so we need to keep our eye on all of that. So what are some of the trends? What's on the policy horizon? In the sheet that you'll be getting afterwards, you will get a listing of some of the public policy issues. And we have found, I have found as someone who was double major in political science and American studies, that a lot of Americans have forgotten their 5th grade civics courses and think in terms of, oh, Congress will pass a tax law or will pass something about the defense and military budget, but really don't get into the nuances. But here are some of the nuances of different bills that we have been, or proposed regulations or court cases that we've been involved in that could impact your nonprofit. The advocacy rights, your state budget, the census, government grants reform. We worked with the Urban Institute and found that 25% of America's governments refuse to pay nonprofits any overhead, otherwise known as indirect costs, 0. And we found and documented that 25% paid 7% or less, and another 25 paid 10% or less. Well, if you look at that and then look at the fact that most governments have an indirect cost rate themselves of 30 to 40%, and then you look at what happens in the private sector, where tech companies have overhead rates of over 70%. And we're supposed to be doing all that on our own backs at 0 or at 3% or at 7%. That's just wrong, fundamentally wrong. So we have been working with the Office of Management Budget, and we were able to get comprehensive grants reform that mandates that any government that is hiring a nonprofit using federal funds must be paying the nonprofit their indirect costs. This will amount to more money per year that go out to nonprofits for the work that they have actually performed than the Gates Foundation will give in an entire year. So this has real impact. And so there's these global things, then there are just the little simple things. There was a nonprofit in New England that was finding that it was paying $40 a week fee for parking violations. What they did, it was for food. It was a soup kitchen, and they were going down and parking in front of City Hall every Wednesday afternoon, and then they would unload the van, and then they would be feeding people and making water available, etc. And invariably, they would then get a ticket. And this nonprofit didn't have a lobbyist, it didn't have anything else, but they did have someone who was on the board who knew the city manager. And the board members were looking, why are we paying $160 a month for parking fees? This is just outrageous. And so the board member went and talked to the city manager and said, you know, we're all kind of on the same team here. We're all trying to take care of the same constituents. Why are we being harmed? And the city manager said, you're absolutely right. And then put on the parking sign saying no parking, it then said except for food deliveries on Wednesday afternoons. And lo and behold, simple solution, because neighbors talk to neighbors, friends talk to friends, and they worked it out. And so don't be thinking of everyday advocacy of having to go out and live at the legislature or hire a lobbyist. It's a matter of just common sense. And that's the power of nonprofits, is common sense. Another piece of common sense is that we need to pull our heads out. Wherever we have our heads, we need to pull them out and get engaged in public policy, because so many people are afraid of it and avoid it. But we've learned that if you're not at the table making decisions, you're on the menu being eaten alive. And we've got to get nonprofits at the policymaking table. Advocacy is in our DNA, folks. If you look back at what the abolitionists did, these were not corporations, these were not government entities, these were Americans coming together through their churches and their synagogues, through their other volunteer groups, saying, this sin on America is wrong. We need to get rid of slavery. We had the suffragists who stepped forward and created what is now has evolved into the League of Women Voters. But back in the day, there were two different competing women's organizations that were out there trying to get women the right to vote. And fortunately, since more than half the women, or half the population are women, and invariably seem to be making better decisions on policy matters than the men do, we need to get more women out voting, and they were successful. The Townsend clubs, I wasn't around at the time of the Great Depression in the 30s, but there was a Dr. Townsend who came along and said, people are suffering. We need to do something for people across America who are not eating, who are in these food lines, who are not sleeping, who are being hurt because they're all without jobs. We need to have some sort of a security blanket. And they all came together. Millions of Americans created Townsend clubs across America calling for the establishment of some security blanket. And then who can forget Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who stood up there on the National Mall just a few blocks from here in his I Have a Dream speech. You can't forget the words, but most of us forget that he was not standing there as just this great orator who was this monument of spirit. He was standing there as the rector of his church, a nonprofit. He was standing there as the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, another nonprofit. He was surrounded by nonprofit people, and he came together and galvanized nonprofits. People across America to come together and say, we are going to change the laws to give people the right to vote, the people the right to travel, the people the right to buy services where they want. And so we need to be remembering these things. And it's part of our legacy. The abolition groups ensured that we were able to elect the nation's first black president. Suffragist groups allow women the right to vote. The Townsend clubs came together and rallied and got Social Security. The civil rights groups got LBJ to sign the law. He knew that he was giving up the South for Democrats, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. And it was because nonprofits came together through the individuals in our local communities. Nonprofit lobbying is legal. We all need to remember that. these are the different public policies out there. Which ones are getting in the way of your mission? Which ones could threaten your mission? Which ones could help you advance your mission? Folks, there is safety in numbers. I don't know how many of you remember the book Swimming and how many of you read it to your kids, but it tells a story of Swimming the fish, who's the black eye there, who is swimming around and noticed that all the fish were being gobbled up by much larger fishes. And they were then all hiding. And then one day they said, enough is enough. And they all rallied together and they started to swim in formation. And it scared away the larger fish because when all the smaller fish came together, they had, in essence, a larger voice. And that's what we need to do as nonprofits, is remember the wisdom of swimming the fish. So where are you going to turn for help when the policy agenda is set up at your local city hall or at your state legislature or with your member of Congress who's looking at a proposal or their proposed rules and regulations? Where are you going to turn for help? I would encourage you to go to your state association of nonprofits, not only to ask for help, but to join them and get your nonprofit connected with them so that your nonprofit can start getting access to information on a regular basis and learn what's happening so that when you need to step forward, you can. You don't have to hire a full-time lobbyist, but if you get together with your state association of nonprofits, you'll then be able to look at things. So now is the time for our questions, ideas, reflections, and before we actually get there, I want to just close with this. Again, ways that you can get involved with your state association, ways that you can get involved with YANA. It's real easy to join, folks. They make it so simple. You can join. You know what? How much it costs? It actually costs $0 to register for this. But if you want to really support YANA, you can then donate $60 and become a full-fledged member and be supporting your fellow nonprofits, your fellow alumni who are trying to do good out in the world. Because we all need to remember, you're not alone. And with that, I will turn things back over to Rachel.
Thank you, Tim. That's really incredible. Thank you for reinvigorating us and inspiring us to remember about the missions we stand for and our organizations stand for. And thank you for the shout outs for YANA. And I also wanted to thank the individuals who shared some of their stories. People talked about involvement with church and Sierra Club, litigating, Dwight Hall at Yale being part of their lives, things like that. If I could just get back to something, I'm sure people will have a question on this if it hasn't popped up already, is can you clarify, like when you say, yes, we can lobby, can you just clarify a little bit, like what does that mean? What does that look like? And what are, not to give legal advice, but just to give some clarity to that statement, because I think you're right, there is a lot of confusion as to what nonprofits can and can't do. And let's assume people are typical charitable nonprofit 501c3s performing direct services, for example.
Thanks. And again, I would just reinforce, I'm not giving legal advice, this is just general education, but think in terms of advocacy. Advocacy is like a big umbrella. It covers all of this area. And now think of, and all advocacy is legal. Advocacy includes filing an amicus brief. It includes going and filing formal comments about proposed rules and regulations. It's a wide variety of things that you can do. Nonprofits, even though we cannot use any of our resources for or against any candidate for public office, i.e. no partisan activities, we can engage in voter education, voter registration, as long as it's open for everybody in the community and you're not targeting registering all R's or registering all D's. As long as it's open for everybody, you can be doing that. All that is advocacy. Legislative lobbying is one narrow part of this larger advocacy span. And that one narrow part of legislative lobbying, and I always try to remember, just get people to think of L when they see the word lobbying, think legislative lobbying. that the L is basically there to say it is still not lobbying if you are talking about a general issue such as fighting poverty, but as soon as you start talking to a legislator or their staff or someone who can be involved in that process, such as a governor who can veto a bill, then you have a call to action to say vote for or against, then that becomes legislative lobbying. But short of that, it's all fair game. And I have for a long time said I have never seen a and so the challenge is that the 501c3 as it's written says that nonprofits may not use a substantial amount of their activities to engage in propaganda, which is the old style version of what they called lobbying. Well, what does substantial amount of your activities mean? And that law was passed in 1933. What is the substantial part? Well, Congress never clarified it. The IRS refused to clarify it. People didn't know, does that mean more than 51%? Does it mean a third? Does it mean a dollar amount? What is it? And then in 1966, there was the Sierra Club was incensed that there was a senator who wanted to build the dam that would back up into the Grand Canyon, and said, this is outrageous, it needs to stop. And they took out full-page ads, only two, but one in the Washington Post and one in the New York Times, that said, this is outrageous, would we flood the Sistine Chapel? Well, that's what we're about to do in flooding these majestic canyons in the Southwest. If you agree with us, the Sierra Club, call, actually it was a congressman, call Congressman X, and here's his telephone number. Well, it turned out that Congressman X didn't like all that extra attention, and it also turns out that he was in charge of the Treasury Department's budget. And so he then cracked down and said, told the Treasury Department and the IRS to go lock down those nasty Sierra Club people and look at their books of records, because he was certain that they had violated the law. And then if you go and look in Life magazine at the time, you'll see IRS agents putting big locks on the Sierra Club doors and carrying out boxes of their records. And that's what imprinted in the minds of attorneys and accountants. Don't go there. Don't even do any lobbying. Well, it turns out that it was good news for the Sierra Club because they quadrupled their membership. People were so outraged that the government came in that way. And then there was more clarity finally added to the law in 1976 that allows nonprofits to take the 501h election. You're still a 501c3, but if you take the election, it then says that there's a bright line, a dollar amount, that basically says that you can't spend more than 15% in the first year of your expenses on lobbying. And if you do, that you will then pay an excise tax on it. Well, for all my years, I had never encountered a nonprofit that had ever exceeded that limit and ever had to pay the penalty. But in 2017, we did. Here, we exceeded that limit because we were fighting to protect the longstanding Johnson Amendment that keeps nonprofits away from the poisonous partisanship that is so dividing the rest of America. And we wanted to keep all of that out and away from nonprofits. Can you imagine going to your church or synagogue or mosque and having the religious leader telling you how to vote, or going into your own boardroom and having people have to decide who your organization is going to be endorsing for president, all the way down to dog catcher? It would be dividing where we all come together to solve community problems. We succeeded, and we then exceeded the limit, and we paid an excise tax. And I now wear that as a proud badge that we were doing what we should be doing. Yes, we had to pay a little extra, didn't break the bank, but we protected nonprofit partisanship. And so, yes, you can engage. Yes, you can do it. Take the 501H election. It's the simplest insurance in America. You fill in your organization's name, you fill in the officer's name, you fill in the address, you plug in the date, and you check a box that says, yes, I want to take the 501H election. And then if you want to stop it for any reason that I've never heard a valid reason for, then you can check it and say, no, we unsubscribe to the 501H election. But it's so simple, folks, and we all should be doing it. Check with your attorney and accountant. Make sure that they agree that you can and should use your constitutional and statutory rights and your moral obligation to speak up for your community.
Thank you. That's above and beyond very helpful information and very clear about that. And yes, I think we all can be doing a better job. One of the points some people have been making about, and I don't know if this is something that's within your area of expertise, is what insight is there to a lot of nonprofits? As you noted, most of them are small budgets. Not everybody's providing direct services in large organizations, fee for services, the way hospitals and schools are. Are you seeing anything that's helping with revenue streams? And I know we've a lot of people, we're operating on a shoestring. Lower salaries make it hard for people to get into nonprofits and to do the work. Any thoughts about that? Just income and revenue streams.
Yes, we all, thank you, Rachel. We all need to be looking at our own personal involvement with our community and be thinking, and this may be sacrilegious, sorry, but not just writing the big check to Mother Yale, but also writing checks to your local community organizations. Get involved with them, invest your time, your blood, sweat, and tears for your community. It is so soul clearing and rewarding, and you will then see the great need. And what is the single most important thing you can do to help raise money? It's make the ask. Make the ask. If you don't ask, people won't. And so we all need to do a better job of making the ask. I will demonstrate how the ask works, which is this is available for free for anyone in the country. The other resources that you will find on our website are available for free. We have been told by consultants and others that we should be charging for our intellectual property because it's the best that they say that they've seen out there. And yet we've insisted at the staff level, and the board has backed us, to make sure that this is available for anyone. The small nonprofit in the barrios of Phoenix or LA, and the inner city nonprofit in New York City or Chicago, and the nonprofits in rural parts of the country. They need access to this just as much as the big universities and the big hospitals. And so if you believe in what we're doing, I hope that you will feel free to find a way to contact me, and then I can talk to you about making a donation. If you are more inspired by YANA's mission, go to their website. It's real easy. It just, you are not alone, YANA, on the website, and then put in Yale next to it, and your Google search will find it. Click on it, and as you're registering to be a member, you will then also be able to make a donation. One of the ways that you can make your donation is also to support Dwight Hall. I personally got to work at Dwight Hall. I was a bursary student working my way through the university and got to know some people there, Herb Cain and others, David Warren, etc. Just wonderful souls who influenced my life. And we need to give back to Dwight Hall and the students there who are learning about their own values to then go out and make a big difference in the world. So make the ask, folks. That's the way to do it. And get involved. Roll up those sleeves, make a difference.
Tim, thank you again. I don't see any questions right now, but I'm sure that people will think of things as they digest all this information. Very much appreciate the work you are doing, and thank you to everyone online and who's watching this at a later date, who's involved in nonprofits some way, and we know all of our members are. We have an open survey right now to get some feedback, and everybody is on a board, donating, volunteering, and our goal is to bring more people into that network. And as Tim was saying with nonprofits, we want to really harness that power, that enthusiasm, that those mission-driven people, so we can do more and better in our communities and in our country. So thank you again, Tim. Best of luck, and we will certainly continue on to support you and the work you do and each other. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you at our next YANA event in your neighborhood. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Rachel.